I want to introduce Laron Williams. He is the Frederick A. Middlebush Chair of Political Science in the Truman School of Government and Public Affairs at the University of Missouri. He holds a PhD in political science from Texas A&M University. His substantive research interests center on electoral accountability, public opinion, and party competition. Laron's methodological research interests center on spatial econometrics, excuse me, I should have practiced that before I started, time series, which we're going to be talking about today, and interpretation practices. His work has been published in the American Journal of Political Science, Journal of Politics, Political Analysis, and Political Research and Methods, among others. He's here today to talk about his work on the Most Important Problem Dataset, an updated version of which has recently been published on Roper. The two versions have been downloaded a combined 1,000+ times from our site. So it's a very, very popular data set for very good reasons. And Laron's going to take it away to explain what he's done to create this data set and how it can be used. And again, add your questions to the Q&A. Laron, you can start sharing.
Okay, thank you, Kathleen, and appreciate the invitation to come out and talk to everybody about this data set. So can everyone see my screen? Everyone's good? Okay. So thank you all for attending. I appreciate you taking the time out of your schedules. I know that this might be finals week for some people, or lucky other people, it might be the start of summer, so I appreciate you attending this presentation. Like Kathleen mentioned, this is going to cover the most important problem data set. And so I'll first discuss basically give an overview of the initial release of the data. And then I'll talk about some changes for the most recent update, which I call 3 innovations. And then I'll briefly talk about some possible applications at the end and show you where to get the data and all that fun stuff. So this is a project that I have with Murat Yildirim, who was a Mizzou PhD student, but there's been a lot of other students who've helped me out with this project along the way. And so thank you to them too. Okay, so to begin the presentation, let's start near the beginning of modern polling. And so one of the first earliest available surveys available from Roper is from a Gallup survey, and that's from January 1939. And if we look at the code book, which is very interesting, and a nerdy aside, if you have the chance to look at these older code books, I encourage you to do that. I love peeking at these old code books. You look and you see these little nodes. And if you've never had the joy of like matching up the numbers on the code book to the column locations and the cards and bringing in the data that way, it's great. But that's a nerdy aside. But if you look at these code books, you basically get a sense of what is going on in that country at that time. And so the most important problem question has been asked since the very beginning. And here we have one of the most, a classic early wording of that question. What do you regard as the most important problem before the American public today? And responses to that open-ended question are then coded into a lot of different categories. And some of these categories are quite short. For example, a value of 2 means labor. It's a short category, but overall quite broad and probably incorporates a lot of different things related to labor. Other categories are longer and include multiple potential little categories in there. Like number 7, business restoration, reestablish confidence, improvement of business and industry, keep the government out of business. In this survey, there's nearly 70 different categories of responses to that most important problem question. And having access to these early data at such a pivotal time in American history is just a treat. And it's basically like a time travel machine where you get to go back in time to understand which issues voters cared about at the time. So this is in 1939. And so we see that all the issues that matter for voters. So elimination of political graft, the use of leisure time, control of cancer and venereal disease. These are important issues at the time, important enough that a lot of people mentioned it and they were put into that category. But what does this most important problem mean? What can it tell us? So if we look at the the political science research, we can get a sense of how we can use that most important problem question and how or what it tells us about the American public. And so we can look at it in terms of in the at the individual level, but also at the aggregate level. So at the individual level, we can see things like the importance of a particular issue in somebody's vote choice depends on how important that issue is or how influential that issue is for that voter. That's at the individual level. In the aggregate, we can probably learn some things about the American public electorate overall. So we can probably see things like issue importance or the degree to which a particular issue is a problem for voters. We can look at priorities for government action, and we can aggregate it together to put together some sort of policy agenda or public's agenda, but it probably doesn't mean issue salience. So there's a lot of good ways we can use the most important problem data set, and there's other ways that are probably not as useful. But once I realized all the different ways we can draw inferences from that most important problem question, I wanted to see how available it was, how much data are actually out there. And this is the stage of the process where the Roper Center was instrumental. And so we started trying to find as many nationally representative surveys that asked that question as possible. And ideally, we would be able to find the surveys that provided the individual level responses, because that's what we cared about at the time. So altogether, there's somewhat close to 700 separate surveys with individual data that ask that most important problem question. And here we have the number of surveys per year from 1939 to 2015. And we have the number of surveys by year. And so we can see that early on, in the first couple decades, there aren't many surveys asked or that have that question per year. And then starting in the late 70s, early 80s, there's at least 6 or 7 surveys per year, which gives you an idea or gives you a sense that you could do some time series analysis on these data. And then from 2015 on, the availability of respondent level data drops off quite a bit. And so the top line data is still available, but it seems like polling companies have been less likely to provide that data to the Roper Center. And so maybe some of the people who are more plugged into the data process could describe why exactly or explain to me why the number of surveys has dropped off quite a bit in the last 10 years. But if we aggregate all these surveys, we end up with nearly 75, 76 years of this question being asked. And we have somewhat over 900,000 unique responses to the most important problem question. So once I saw this with my grad student co-authors, we realized we had to collect the data. We had to put this stuff together so that people could access the individual level data and use it in their own work. So after a couple of years of work with excellent grad students, at the time, Colton Heffington and Brandon Park, we produced the most important problem data set. And this is the first release of the most important problem data set all the way back in 2019. And so we take those 900,000 responses and we hand coded each response into a coding scheme with, at the time, about 60 different categories. We then published this article in Conflict Management and Peace Science as a companion to the data set. Now it's published in CMPS, which, if you're a public opinion expert, is probably not the journal that you would look for to learn about American public opinion and American issue importance. But at the time, we were really focused in on how the American public responds to foreign policy events. And so looking back, we probably could have picked a better journal or a more specific journal. But overall, we're happy with this piece in CMPS that introduces that data set to a broader audience. So here's a look at the coding scheme. And so we have 60 some categories, and those are collapsible into 15 general categories. And in this table, we provide some examples of the categories that fall into this economy, big general category, and then social policy, another big category. And so that means you could look at how individuals are viewing different issues that are either very general, like economic issues, or you can go even more specific, like inflation, or even concerns about prices for food, housing, healthcare, education, etc. So we think that's pretty useful. Or you can do what we initially did and focus on foreign policy. So here we have a time series plot of foreign policy issue importance for the American voters. Each dot here reflects an estimate of the percentage of Americans who, in that poll, identified a foreign policy issue as the most important problem facing the country at that time. We also provide a smoother to get a sense of that trend over time. And the shaded areas represent times where the US is involved in a war. And then at the top, we've just picked out a few different crises or salient foreign policy events. We can therefore use these data to do something like this, to get a sense of how the American electorate responds to salient foreign policy events by shifting their concerns about what issues they care about. When something salient happens in the foreign domain, voters typically shift their attention to that foreign policy issue. We've got respondent level data, excuse me. So we can slice the data in a whole number of different ways. We've got additional data on ideology of the respondent, age, income, education, race, gender, a whole bunch of things. Another variable that we have is partisan identification. And so we can see how partisan identification influences foreign policy issue importance. So on the left side, we've got self-identified Democrats, and on the right side, we've got self-identified Republicans, and then we've got the same plot overall, but just the percentage of each of those categories. And so we can do these kind of cool analyses where we can show that Democrats and Republicans might care a little bit more about foreign policy on average, but overall they tend to respond to these events in the similar type of way of shifting their attention towards those issues. And this is something that I think is useful not only for foreign policy, but you can open it up to basically any general issue that you care about, social policy, civil rights, things like that. And so that was the first release of the Most Important Problem Dataset. And we're pretty happy with how much scholarly attention it got. And we think it's been useful in other scholars' work dealing with things like civil rights attention, crime, the president's policy agenda, but also it's been useful for the Policy Agendas Project and the Comparative Policy Agendas Project in linking how the media and legislation and elite cues interact with American public opinion. So we're really happy at that point with how much the data set had been used. But of course, once you look back after a couple of years, you realize that there's some things in the data set that you probably should have changed or wanted to upgrade, additional things that would increase the usefulness of it. So initially, we collected all possible nationally representative surveys that asked some variation of that most important problem or most important issue question. And that included all the ANES data, which I'll get to in a minute, and most of the data from Roper that asked that at the individual level. There's some top-line data, but that's not included in this data set since it's a focus on individual level data. And then if you wanted to aggregate all that individual level data up to the national level, you can do that as well at different time periods, monthly, quarterly, or annual. So in this second release of the data, we also provided an article companion, and this one is in Journal of Elections, Public Opinion and Parties, and this project was with Murat Yildirim. And so this second release of the data came about just from brainstorming between us, talking to people who had used it, getting a sense of what they wanted the data for and how we could improve the data. And so we identified 3 innovations that we think improve the usefulness of this updated release of the Most Important Problem Dataset available from Roper. Let's talk about those 3 innovations. For the first innovation, let's consider some of the details of the polling process and how that influences the data, our data collection. And so recall that is an open-ended question. what is the most important problem facing the country today? And so ideally, polling companies would provide the verbatim responses, which is something that ANES does from 84 on. But polling companies don't do that. They're limited as to how many response values they can provide for any open-ended question like the MIP. So no matter how many responses you get, you have to categorize those into a small number of response categories. And for example, if we look at the CBS New York Times poll from January 1982, we see that one of the categories that is provided for us is morality/drugs. So any respondent who had any response that was related to morals, morality, drug use, things like that, is coded a value of 1 or 2, representing that morality/drugs category. In the first release of the Most Important Problem Dataset, we provide a single value for each response. So each respondent gets one value on that Most Important Problem Dataset. And as a result, we would have to take that original response and code it into something else. And in the first version of that dataset, we coded it as morals and values. But clearly there's something off here, because what about drugs? Maybe that respondent said something about drug use or legalization or something like that. There would be some slippage between the open-ended response that the respondent provides, how the coder codes it, and then how our dataset did it. And so we thought this was clearly a problem. So the first innovation in our second release is to switch from coding responses to coding quasi-responses. And that allows us to code each mentioned response. So instead of having one category for this respondent, we have 2 categories, morality and drugs, which we call quasi-responses. That means that there's no slippage between the initial response and how we're coding it. So this person gets 2 codes, morals and values, which is a 901 in our data set, and then drugs, which is 404. It's also important to note that these 2 quasi-responses fall into different general categories. So morality is in the 900s, and then law and order would be in the 400s. And as a consequence of this, that single respondent would be in the data set twice because they've got 2 quasi-responses. And so we would give each of those observations an analytical weight of 0.5. And so we think this is a better way of coding these responses than we did in the first case, because there's less slippage between what the respondent said and what we know. It also takes into account what we don't know. That respondent might have said drugs, might have said morality, and so it's more uncertain, and we think providing a single code, like morals and values, overestimates our certainty about what the respondent actually said. And we think this is a better approach, especially as polling companies provide more response categories and as the response values decrease. Let's look at another example. This is also from that CBS January 1982 poll. And this response category is all responses that are other domestic, disabled people, poor, welfare, unions, or crime. That would be given a value of 15 or 16 in that code. In that original Most Important Problem dataset, we would have coded that as some broad category, like social policy. But in reality, there's 6 different quasi-responses that could be in that category. Domestic issues, disabled people, poor, welfare, unions, crime. And not only are there 6 quasi-responses, but those fall into at least 3 different big categories, general categories. Things like economic policy, social policy, and then law and order. And so quasi-responses, we think, is a better approach to coding that. The second innovation arises because as we switch from responses to quasi-responses, we've got a lot more variation in the responses that we hear from these respondents. And so that requires a more expansive coding scheme in a few different ways. And so the first way we've added to the coding scheme is we've got a lot more subcategories available. So if we look, for example, at the rights category, all these shaded cells are subcategories that we added to the coding scheme in the second release of the Most Important Problem Dataset. And so not only do we say gender rights, but we also have gender rights related to employment or politics or attitudes. And if you really dig deep and explore the data, you can see that these subcategories are more often found in the most recent polls rather than in the earlier polls. That's because the more recent polls are the ones that provide typically more response categories. And so early on in our data set, you might have a civil rights response value, but now we've got more information and now it's more about voter disenfranchisement or something like that. Another change to our coding scheme is that we've added some directional subcategories where available. So if the individual provides a direction for something, and that direction is captured in the response values, then we've coded that as, for example, too little government spending, a neutral mention of government spending, or too much government spending. Researchers can then use those subcategories, those directional categories, in their analysis. Now, this is not perfect because a lot of this is constrained by how the polling company describes those response values. However, it's available if researchers feel like they want to do some individual level directional analysis. Another improvement to the coding scheme is the addition of area categories. So anytime a respondent identifies a particular country or a region, we provide an area category. And so, for example, with all these foreign policy categories, these all have area data available. So if it's in the original response, it's going to be in the most important problem data set. For example, if we have responses like foreign aid in Israel, war in Ukraine, Ethiopia, famine in Ethiopia, then we code both the issue, which would be foreign aid, war, and famine, but also the area, Israel, Ukraine, and Ethiopia. And that allows you to focus on foreign policy issues and track how the relative importance of different geographic areas change over time. So that's the second innovation. The third innovation goes back to the fundamental nature of this most important problem question. Ideally, we would have the free text or open-ended responses for this. Fortunately, with the ANES, we do. The ANES from 1984 through 2020 and 2024 provide the actual verbatim free text responses. And so it's okay if you can't see this, we're going to walk you through it. But here we have the first 10 responses that are available from the ANES for the 1984 election study. And we've got the actual verbatim responses for the respondents to the most important problem, and then to a follow-up question asking them, of those that you mentioned, what is the most important problem? So let's look at an example here. So if we look at this third respondent, they provide the free text response, abortion, the national deficit, and arms control. What I mean to say was nuclear war. I think we should be with other countries as far as that's concerned. We should have as many nuclear arms as Russia does. Abortion, it should not be legal unless it's a case of rape or incest. National defense, how the country should pay its national debt is a big question, a big problem. So just hearing that, you get a sense of like how these responses look. And then we've got the most important response, which this respondent said was the deficit. In the new data, we actually code these verbatim responses according to quasi-responses. And there's just a wealth of data out there available. And so here we have all the different ANES from 1984 to 2020. Now 2024 is available. But overall, there's something like 71,000 open-ended responses. Questions for, what are the most important problems? What's the first, second, third, and so on. There's so much valuable information for scholars to use, and I think they can use our data set to help them answer some really interesting questions about politics. For example, something that Murat Yildirim and I have done, how many different quasi-responses do respondents provide? A sense of agenda diversity at the individual level. And then among all the problems mentioned, how do they select which one is the most important problem? If there's clusters of quasi-responses that appear together, and maybe those clusters respond to partisan topics, and is that changing over time? There's just a lot out there that you could answer with these free text responses. But since we've got data from 1984 to 2020, we have to normalize the data a little bit. And we've been fortunate that the question wording in this period and overall has been remarkably consistent over time. What do you think is the most important problem facing the country today? But besides that, how they code the most important problem varies a little bit. We can identify 3 stages. In the first stage, they code the open-ended most important problem response up to the 3rd mention. So they ask, what do you think are the most important problems facing the country today? The coder then codes that open-ended response into 3 or 4 categories. What's the first mention, second mention, third mention, and then the most important mention. In the second stage, the respondent is only asked the first most important problem, and then they're asked, what is the second most important problem? And then 2008 is somewhat different in terms of question wording because it's the most important political problem instead of most important problem. It's a small but important variation. And then in the third stage, starting in the 2012, the ANES started providing more informative codes of those open-ended responses. So they ask, what do you think are the most important problems facing the country today? And if there's more than one, briefly tell me one problem now. The coder then takes those codes and splits them up into ideas, sort of a quasi-response sort of thing, little chopped up ideas. And so we think that provides a lot more information to for people to use. So in our data set, we code all available responses to all those questions. We split them up into ideas or quasi-responses, and then we code them based on 110 specific categories and then 15 general categories. Let's look at an example. So here we have that open-ended response from 1984. The first step is for us to clean up the original response. So correcting misspelled words, removing interviewer notes, and splitting up into quasi-responses, which is why we've got those slashes. And then in the last step, we code each of those quasi-responses according to our coding scheme, and we can downweight respondents based on the number of different quasi-responses that they provide. And then we've got another snapshot of that coding scheme. But we think there's a lot of different applications that people can use here. And what's nice about the data set is that it starts at the respondent level, but it can be aggregated up into different levels, state level and even national level. But we've got some ideas for different applications and things we've done, but we want to just leave it up to you. Like we found that most other people are more creative about using the data set than we are because we tend to be pretty in the weeds about these processes. So if you use it, tell us how you're using it, and that'll shape future releases. So at the individual level, there's a lot of different things you can do. And remember, we've got data on a whole bunch of other characteristics: partisanship, ideology, race, gender, age, and education, etc. So you can split up the data that way into different subgroups and do subgroup analysis over time. Or you can look at the respondent level, things like, how does economic insecurity influence the importance of prices? Do elite cues shape the importance of issues for partisans? And then what we cared about, who cares about foreign policy? We could also aggregate it up to different levels. We've got the states that the respondents are in. And so we can calculate things like the average percentage of the different most important problem categories across states. And here, something that is not very interesting, not very illuminating, it basically tells us exactly what we'd expect. So what are the issues that different states care about? The economy, employment, inflation, war. Yeah, that makes sense. We can do some other things we think are more interesting. So for example, we can see which issues are disproportionately more important for some states than others. And so those are states that voters in that state prioritize to a much greater extent than other states. And so we create a standardized variable that we call the disproportionality. And here's a snapshot of a few. And so it's kind of reasonable. There is some face validity here. Arizona voters care about immigration. California voters care about pollution. Connecticut cares disproportionately about school violence for good reason. Florida, healthcare, etc. We can also plot these across states, and we see very interesting spatial distributions on things like racism, discrimination, immigration, and agricultural issues. But the most important problem data set can be aggregated to also represent annual snapshots of issue importance. So for this one, I'm going to switch my screen and share, let's see, share my personal website, which allows you to explore some of the stuff at the annual level. Okay, so here's my personal website. If we scroll down a little bit, we can click on this link, and it takes us to a nice little Shiny app. And we can explore the data in different slices at different time periods at different temporal domains. So for example, we could look at the most important problem data, the general categories. We could look at economic issues annually from 1939 to 2018. And then if we go to how important is the problem, we can click on that and click on plot, and hopefully it will show up with no mistakes. There you go. So we've got a nice annual time series of the importance of the economy over time. And so if you didn't want to get into the individual level data and you just wanted to use it for an illustration or something maybe in teaching, you could certainly use that. You can click on statistics and get the 5 lowest percentages, 5 highest percentages, summary statistics, a description of what that value actually measures. Or you can go back to plot and you can download the plot, and it'll download it as a PDF. You can go back and split it up into different ways. So for example, we could look at Policy Agendas Project, how they split up their categories, macroeconomics, and then we could look at that by gender. Plot that. And so now we've got the importance of macroeconomics for males and females over time at the annual level. But what if we're just interested in what issues were important at that time? If we click on what is the most important problem and then plot, we get the most important category for each year over time. And then if we wanted to download those data, we can go here and click download data. But that's all I'll do for now. I'm going to switch back to my slides. Otherwise, I'll be here all day if I just keep looking at different ways we can use the data. Okay, so where can you find the data? At the individual level, the second release of the most important problem data set is at the Roper Center. And then the aggregate data is at my personal website. And then the open-ended ANES stuff is coming soon. I just realized that the 2024 data are out there, so that probably means we're going to be adding to that. And to conclude, thanks to a bunch of the former PhD students who've helped me at various points along the way, Colton Heffington, Brandon Park, Min-Kyu Chang, and Marat. And then a big thanks to the Roper Center for letting me deposit the data there. The Roper Center is an excellent resource for research and helping you generate research ideas. You can just browse collections. And I've used it a ton in my teaching. Anytime a student makes a claim like the American public doesn't feel that way, I say, go to Roper, show me the data. So be sure to use it in your own research and teaching. With that, I'm excited to hear your questions and comments.
Love to hear that. Love to hear that. Thank you, Laron. So the first question is a very straightforward question about definitions. What is the difference between issue importance and issue salience?
Yeah, that's a good question, and there's been a lot of work on that by political scientists. Chris Flasian has done some interesting work on comparing so how can we actually look at which issues are salient for voters? And does that most important problem question give us a sense of which issues are salient or which issues are a problem. Because some people might think that jobs are the most salient issue. However, if unemployment is low, then it's not technically a problem. And so there's a distinction between which issues voters might think is the most important issue for that country at that election compared to the extent to which it's an actual problem. Because if unemployment is low, then jobs might be the most important issue, but it's not a problem. And so if people are wanting to use the most important problem data set for issue salience, I would probably encourage them to look at that literature and think carefully about whether it's actually measuring what they want it to measure.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. I'm really curious about the problems that you had in doing this work. So obviously, this is not the only example of open-ended responses for questions that have been asked over time. Making these normalized is a massive undertaking. And I'm curious, what were the hardest things that you dealt with? And specifically, I'm really curious about are there particular topics where the framework, how we understand the problem, changed so much that it was hard to finesse that shift because the entire way we talk about the problem had changed?
Yeah, great question. And and I think I'm fortunate in this example because the wording for the most important problem question has stayed remarkably consistent over time. There are some variations, and basically, anytime we hear most important problem or most important issue, we collected the data. And then we provided an additional question that coded exactly how the question was worded. So scholars can pick out which ones work for them and which ones don't. There's some variation in terms of like, what are the most important problems that you want Congress to deal with or the president to deal with, things like that. They're in the data, but they're typically not used when we're producing annual measures. So that's a quick little aside that we're very fortunate that the question wording is remarkably consistent over time. And the free text responses, those come from 1984 up to the present. And there's not many issues in terms of normalizing those data. The big changes are when at different election cycles or different election studies, they code that open response in a different way, and there's different follow-up questions and different like interviewer prompts that you need to make sure that they're consistent over time, and that's been a little bit tricky. Besides that, when we're normalizing the data for these other variables, you have to lose some information in some way. So, for example, the economic evaluations variable, which I care about. I do a lot of economic voting. And so that retrospective national economic evaluations variable usually goes from 1 being much worse, the economy's gotten much worse, to 5 being much better. And most surveys do something like that. Other surveys only ask 3 items, or worse, same, or better. And so when you're normalizing over 75 years, you've got a lot of cases like economic evaluations where you've got to go from a variable that has a lot of information with like 5, 7 different categories and smush it into something that is normalized that only has 3. And so you're losing some of that information, but we think the gains that you get from being able to do the sort of inferential analysis over this huge time period is more than makes up for the loss of information.
So a follow-up question from an audience member who says, not a political scientist here. I still don't understand the difference between issue importance and issue salience. Is importance the subjective perception by the respondents and salience the measurable problemness of that issue, or is that reversed? Can you just give a little more definition in those terms?
Yeah. So I would say that this most important problem is not issue salience. Like that something is that's different, right? There's a conflation of like the extent to which it is important to a voter with the extent to which it is a problem or a salient issue. And so I know at various times in this talk I said salience. Ugh, I try not to, but those I think are different. And
So
so,
salience would be then that it is always inherently important, but not necessarily affecting that respondent at that moment. Is that
yes, that's right. Jobs, values, if if the circumstances are good in that country in those areas, then it's not going to be the most important problem, but it still might be the most important issue or the most salient issue for that voter. And so I understand that if you're outside of political science and you're not in the weeds in this literature, like you might listen to that and be like, I still don't know the difference. Maybe we don't either, a little bit. So, but I would say that if you're thinking about issue importance or the public agenda, things like that, then the most important problem is a great resource for you. If you're looking for issue salience, it's probably not perfect.
so? Another question from a member of the audience here. Can these data help explain why some polls, like the Iowa poll prior to the presidential election, we'll be talking about that one for years, were not accurate? Would they have foretold or suggested measurement error? So can you get anything out of about measurement error out of the most important problem series?
Oh, great question. So I think the most important problem question overall, I think gives you a lot more information that just asking vote choice or approval you don't get at. The issue, though, is that so few of these polling companies provide the open-ended responses. And so what we see in outside of the ANES, what we see in the vast majority of these situations is 10 categories, 15 categories. And the economy, social policy, jobs, inflation, war, things like that, that are very broad. What we cannot get from those 10 categories is any measure of sentiment or the strength of those opinions. But when you read the open-ended responses, those free text responses, that stuff comes screaming through. You get a sense of sometimes you don't want to know what's going on in their heads, but you get a sense of what these reviewer, these respondents are actually thinking about, especially when you give them the chance to type out their responses and provide their own responses. It's a window into their brain, and you find out how upset they are about the issues. You find out the strength of those issues in a way that you cannot possibly just find out by seeing that there's an 8 on this value, right? It provides so much more information. And so I wish more polling companies provided those free text responses because there's just so much information out there that political scientists, sociologists, economists, everybody can use to try to figure out maybe the sentiment is swinging in a different way. Maybe people are stronger in their opinions for the Republicans rather than the Democrats. Maybe we're missing something out in that respect. But yeah, great question.
I will say, over the last decade that I have been here, the interest in open-endeds has increased because people are doing more sentiment analysis, text analytics of various sorts, using different tools that are being developed. And so if there are data providers on the call, I know there are, we do encourage you, please share
Yes.
these. There's a lot of researchers who are really interested in what can be done, and not just in the older approaches of collapsing them into a handful of categories.
And just to jump in, the growth in LLM models and AI stuff, I don't want to think about how much time I devoted to hand coding all these things with my grad students and then compare that to what an LLM could do in just probably a few hours. And so if you provide these open-ended responses, we can get a sense of how accurately hand coding is versus these faster models. We can get a sense of whether it's accurate, more efficient, whether it's picking up on things that hand coders miss. And so the more data that are out there, the better for all of us.
Agreed. So did you discover anything that surprised you in the process of analyzing the data from this data set? Anything you were really not expecting?
Yeah, great question. So I think the most interesting patterns come out of the free text responses because it's great to see like what people care about in 1939 and their stances on isolationism and getting involved in Europe and all that. But I think the more interesting things come from reading people's actual responses. And so, a couple of quick patterns. Um, I think there's a big increase in partisan issues, not partisan issues, but partisan as an issue. Basically, from 1996 up to the present. So rather than people identifying different topics or different policies as the most important problem, they're saying Obama or Trump or Democrats or Republicans or conservatives, whatever. And so they're identifying actors as the most important problem rather than issues or policies or things like that. And I don't know exactly what that means in the big scheme of things. I can't imagine that's good, that people are concerned about um, other actors in the opposition or the government rather than actual things that, that we compete over, issues and policies, things like that. So there's been a lot of that growth over the last few election cycles. And then if you go through the free text responses for 2020, you see a big increase in conspiracies, paranoia, massive distrust of government, distrust of any political official, and it's not a partisan problem either. It's not the Democrats or the Republicans doing it. It's across the board and it's in different patterns. But there's been a lot of that growth, and it's something you don't really see in 2016, 2012, and before that. And so that's troubling. But as a political scientist, that's a pretty cool thing that we can study. So on the one hand, it might be bad for democracy. On the other hand, we get some interesting research projects out of it.
Well, there's that.
Yeah,
Okay, so we get a number of questions here. To what extent can you or do you categorize most important problem by generation or age?
great question. So we've got the age variable in there. And so I could envision some interesting cohort analyses where you're um, seeing how the issue importance of different issues change as cohorts age, and at different cohorts maybe that were had their formative years during the World War II or during the civil rights movement, see how their issues change over time. I haven't done any of that on my own, but we've got the data. So I encourage anyone who's interested to pursue that.
Okay, someone's asking about the methods. I assume the surveying methods have changed significantly over the decades. Of course, they have. Quota sampling up until the early 50s,
Mhm.
switches to area probability, telephone, online. Do you track any information related to sampling method for each poll?
Great question. So we collect as much, I don't know if you want to call it metadata, but data related to the survey administration as possible. So if Roper provides that information, or we can find that information in the code book, then it's in the most important problem data set. Things like whether there's population weights available, the survey mode, fieldwork dates. Um, I don't think I don't think I have response rates in there because those are a little bit tricky to get, especially going back ways.
Right.
But basically, if there's any metadata available, then we've got it in the data set. And when we're collecting this initially, we wanted to cast a broad net. And so we wanted to include as many possible surveys as possible, and then provide the information for scholars to be able to pick out what they wanted to do and how they wanted to deal with weights changing over time and surveying sampling methods and things like that. So we provide the data for you, and let you figure out how you want to use it for your question.
Okay. We have a question here. In what related to your discussion about parties and polarization, in what ways can this data set inform the development of party priorities? In what you've seen here, do you feel like most important problem is informing these priorities, or is it being informed by the agenda set by political parties?
Great question. That's like decades of political science research. I'm certainly not an expert in the relationship between party priorities and public opinion, although I guess I've published a few things on it. So I shouldn't say I'm not an expert, but I would say that reading these free text responses, you get a much deeper understanding of why voters care about these issues. And I think I see much more evidence that the voters are responding to elite cues or the priorities of the parties rather than the opposite. And one of the reasons I say that is that when you're looking through these open-ended responses, you will see voters latch on to things that, looking back 4 or 5 years when I'm coding this stuff, I don't remember what that issue was, but there was some, not crisis, but some little scandal that happened, and it was prioritized by the parties to a great extent. And then it just so happened that that next morning, that person was interviewed and it was on the top of the mind, and they provided that response. And so I think there's a lot of voters responding to the policy priorities of voters rather than the other way around. Now, there's certainly some times where if the American electorate clearly shows that they're concerned about inflation, then the parties will respond to that if they want to be successful and strategic and things like that. But there's so much evidence that these voters are responding to little cues that are provided by these elites that really are not important. They're not even important issues. They're just little things that they're hearing from the parties, and so they're providing that response. Yeah, who knows? Like, it's probably a mixture of causality going both ways, but at least from these most important problem responses, I think it's that voters are responding to elite cues.
Related to those sort of news cycle issues, somebody's asking if there's any way to check most important problem versus news cycle topics. Have you looked into any ways of doing that, I guess, systematically, rather than grinding it?
Excellent question. And anytime I talk about, what the voters are doing, how the parties are talking about an issue, the media is that conduit, right? That's the informational channel that these voters are getting. So you have to include that in any sort of comprehensive approach here. So I haven't done it in my own research, but I know the Policy Agendas Project people, they have coded, and correct me if I'm wrong, but they've coded New York Times articles. And so you can get a sense of how the media coverage changes over time. And so with my data, combined with that media data, and if you get some data on the issues that the parties are talking about throughout the election cycle, you'd be able to put together a pretty good analysis of what is causing what and how one influences the other. But yeah, I think any sort of analysis has to include the media. And I think the best source at this point, and I'm sure there's some other sources if you have those in mind, is that Policy Agendas Project.
Okay. And where is that? Do you know? Oh. Yeah, I'm putting you on the spot.
Policyagendasproject.com. I don't know.
Okay.
It's
People can Google.
Yeah, you can Google. It's a project put together by a whole bunch of people, and it focuses specifically on this issue. So what is driving issue importance, legislative attentiveness, media coverage, parties. Policy Agendas Project.
Yes. So, and this is probably our final question. We're into the last few minutes here. What is the best way to summarize or aggregate open-ended responses without losing the substance? Do you have insights from the work you've done for people who are starting from that first step?
Yeah, it's tough because I mean, thinking about all of the nice things I've said about the free text responses, all of that relates to the amount of information that is available. And so you get all that information that you wouldn't get otherwise. So what happens when you take a response that was 75 words long and had strong feelings and emotions and sentiment and um, went through a variety of issues? How do you take that 75-word statement and give it a number that you can then aggregate? You lose a lot. I think if you have a coding scheme that codes all the quasi responses and then provides plenty of actual values or different coding categories, then you're less likely to use some of that information from that free text. But you're going to lose something no matter what. So then the question becomes, what do I care about for my research question? Do I care about individual level emotional responses? Or do I care about saying something in the aggregate about how the American electorate changes? And depending on your answer to that question, will structure whether you look at the respondent level data or try to aggregate it to the national level. But yeah, great question.
Wonderful. One of the audience members has shared that is comparativeagendas.net for the Policy Agendas Project.
And there's
Comparativeagendas.net.
two there's two parts there. There's like the Policy Agendas Project people, which are US focused, and then the Comparative Agendas Project, and they're all over the globe doing cool stuff. So check them out too.
Okay, so we are at the end of our questions and at the end of our time. So I want to thank you, Laron. That was fascinating. It's amazing work. I would like to thank everyone for joining us here today. Go download the data set, or there's many versions of the data set. Some of that aggregate work is available as different versions, so you can download the appropriate uh, data set for your research question. And if you do something fascinating with us, let us know and we will archive that too.